Barry Byron Mills. In 1967, a teenager from Windsor, California walked into a county jail for the first time. He was 19 years old, and the charge was minor enough that he served just 1 year. 2 years later, he went back in on an armed robbery conviction, this time to the California State Prison system. He would never see the outside world again. Not for a single day. Over the next 5 decades, Barry Byron Mills would rise from a nobody in the yard at San Quentin to the leader of the most violent white supremacist prison gang in American history. And by the time investigators finally built a case against him, the body count had reached a number that federal prosecutors could only describe as staggering. It was the early 1970s, and Mills had just arrived at San Quentin State Prison. The Aryan Brotherhood had been founded there in 1964, built from a loose collection of white inmates who organized along racial lines in a system already fractured by gang warfare. At the time, California's prisons were some of the most dangerous institutions in the country. The Black Guerrilla family, the Mexican Mafia, and Nuestra Familia were all fighting for control, and white inmates without gang affiliation were frequent targets. The AB formed as a survival mechanism, but it evolved into something far more organized and far more lethal than any of its founders intended. Mills joined during those early years and climbed quickly. He was smart, violent when he needed to be, and utterly ruthless with anyone who crossed the organization. By the end of the decade, he had transferred into the federal system and landed at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, where he cemented his position alongside another rising AB leader named Tyler Bingham. Then, in 1979, Mills showed exactly what kind of leader he intended to be. At USP Atlanta, he lured a fellow inmate named John Marsloff into a recreation shack under the pretense of giving him a tattoo. Once inside, Mills nearly decapitated Marsloff with a homemade knife. The motive came down to a gambling debt and a botched drug deal. The 11th Circuit upheld the murder conviction after Mills tried to claim another inmate had actually committed the killing. The court did not buy it, and somehow, it gets worse. According to the 2002 federal indictment, Mills had been sitting on the Aryan Brotherhood's 3-man federal commission since 1980, running the gang's operations in narcotics, gambling, extortion, and contract murder across the entire federal prison system. The commission functioned like a board of directors for organized violence. Members communicated through coded letters, messages hidden inside legal mail, and couriers who moved between institutions carrying orders that could not be traced back to the leadership. In 1996, Mills proposed absorbing the rival Dirty White Boys, a smaller white supremacist gang that operated in several federal institutions. The following year, he and Bingham issued the order that launched the AB's war against a faction called the DC Blacks. The violence that followed spread across multiple federal institutions and resulted in multiple deaths within weeks of the initial directive. The government's case, filed as United States versus Mills, went to trial in 2006 in Santa Ana, California, before Judge David O. Carter. Over 5 months, prosecutors laid out a pattern of murder and organized crime that spanned decades. The trial was built on testimony from AB defectors, intercepted communications, and years of intelligence work gathered across dozens of federal institutions. Mills's defense attorney, Mark Fleming, argued the entire case rested on cross-contamination between informants housed together in ADX Florence's H Unit, men who had every incentive to cooperate and every opportunity to match their stories. The prosecution dismissed that argument outright. Mills was convicted of substantive RICO conspiracy and the murders of Arva Lee Ray at Lompoc in 1989 and D.C. Blacks members Frank Joyner and Abdul Salam at Lewisburg in 1997. Federal prosecutors argued in open court that Mills had personally ordered dozens of bloody attacks and bore responsibility for at least 14 murders. The Anti-Defamation League called the case incredibly damaging to the Brotherhood as an organization. The jury spent days deliberating his sentence. They split 9-3 in favor of death, but could not reach unanimity. Mills received life without parole. After the sentencing, federal prosecutor Terry Flynn told reporters that the verdict had sent a message not only to the Aryan Brotherhood, but to every prison gang that inmates cannot kill other inmates with impunity. Mills spent his remaining years at ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado. He died there on July 8, 2018, one day after his 70th birthday. The Fremont County coroner told the local newspaper that the death did not appear to be suspicious. It was natural causes. He had fathered a son in 1986 while incarcerated, naming the boy Aryan. The mother was the daughter of another AB member. Mills had spent 51 consecutive years behind bars and had never once been a free adult. And no, I'm not making that up. He went in as a teenager, became the most feared gang leader in federal prison history, and died in a concrete cell at a supermax without ever walking a public street again. But Mills was not the only man whose name became synonymous with the Aryan Brotherhood's reign of terror behind bars. The man who earned the nickname Terrible Tom would take the violence even further, and his actions on a single October afternoon in 1983 would reshape the entire federal prison system permanently. Thomas Edward Silverstein. On October 22, 1983, a corrections officer named Merle Klutz was escorting an inmate to the showers at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. The inmate was shackled, the walk was routine, and within minutes, Officer Klutz was dead, stabbed 40 times with a homemade weapon. The man who killed him, Thomas Silverstein, had slipped his handcuffs using a key that another inmate had passed to him moments earlier. That single act of violence triggered a permanent lockdown of USP Marion that lasted 23 years and became the direct catalyst for the construction of ADX Florence, the most restrictive prison ever built on American soil. What nobody knew at the time was that Silverstein had already killed 3 men inside federal walls before he ever touched Merle Klutz. And the story of how he got there reads like a slow-motion collapse that the Bureau of Prisons watched happen and failed to stop. Silverstein was born Thomas Edward Conway in Long Beach, California in 1952. He was adopted at 4 by a man named Sid Silverstein, and his childhood unraveled quickly from there. He cycled through the California Youth Authority, and by 19 in 1971, landed at San Quentin on an armed robbery charge. San Quentin in the early 70s was ground zero for California's prison gang wars. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla Family, the Mexican Mafia, and Nuestra Familia were all fighting for territory and survival inside those walls. Silverstein was young, white, and violent enough to attract the attention of the AB. But he was paroled in '75 before the gang could fully absorb him. He lasted barely a year on the outside. He was arrested alongside his biological father, Thomas Conway, and a cousin named Gerald Hoff for a string of armed robberies that netted less than $11,000 combined. By 1977, he was serving a 15-year federal sentence at USP Leavenworth, where he officially joined the Aryan Brotherhood. This time, the commitment was permanent. His first kill came in 1980. At Leavenworth, Silverstein stabbed an inmate named Danny Atwell to death after Atwell refused to smuggle heroin. He was convicted and sentenced to life, though that conviction was later overturned after jailhouse informants were exposed as perjurers. Then came Robert Chappelle in 1981 at USP Marion's control unit. Chappelle was strangled in his cell, and Silverstein was convicted alongside Clayton Fountain, receiving an additional life sentence. Silverstein maintained his innocence in Chappelle's death for the rest of his life. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. A DC Blacks leader named Raymond Smith, known as Cadillac, did not believe Silverstein's claims of innocence. Smith made repeated attempts on Silverstein's life over Chappelle's murder. Silverstein later said he tried to tell Smith he had not killed Chappelle, but Smith would not listen. And the prison did nothing to keep them apart, even though everyone on the unit knew what was happening. In 1982, Silverstein and Fountain stabbed Smith 67 times. The retaliation had been brewing for months, and the institution had done nothing to prevent it. Then came October 22, 1983. Silverstein later claimed that Officer Klutz had been systematically destroying his artwork, which was one of the few things keeping him sane inside the control unit. Silverstein was a surprisingly skilled painter and spent hours producing work that gave his existence some kind of meaning behind the walls. The Bureau of Prisons and the FBI investigated the claim and cleared Klutz of any misconduct. Regardless of the motive, the autopsy confirmed exactly 40 stab wounds. Klutz had been ambushed in a corridor during what should have been a routine escort. Hours after Silverstein killed Klutz, Clayton Fountain used the exact same method on the same unit to kill another officer, Robert Hoffman, and wound 2 more. 2 guards dead on the same day, in the same building, using the same handcuff key technique. The back-to-back murders shut Marion down permanently. The institution went into a total lockdown that lasted 23 years and became the direct model for ADX Florence, which opened in 1994 as the first purpose-built federal supermax. Following the killings, BOP Director Norman Carlson ordered Silverstein placed under formal no human contact status indefinitely. He was moved through a series of increasingly extreme isolation cells, starting with a 6-by-7-foot windowless underground cell at USP Atlanta called the Side Pocket, where a single light burned overhead around the clock. There was no natural light, no sense of time passing, no sound except the occasional clanging of a meal tray slid through a slot. He was later transferred to what staff at Leavenworth nicknamed the Silverstein Suite, then to Range 13 at ADX Florence, where his only neighbor was World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Youssef. The federal government had essentially built a prison within a prison specifically to hold one man. Silverstein described the experience as sitting in your very own personalized coffin, watching yourself rot away day by day, minute by minute, wondering which part of yourself is first to decay. He told biographer Pete Early that the isolation was designed not just to contain him, but to erase him. By the time he died on May 11, 2019, at a Denver hospital following heart surgery, Silverstein had spent approximately 12,985 consecutive days in solitary confinement. That is over 35.5 years without meaningful human contact. It remains the longest documented stretch of solitary in the history of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. In a 2011 court declaration, he wrote that even his words of regret felt inadequate to explain the remorse he carried. As of his last known count in May of that year, he had personally tallied 10,220 days in isolation. He was 67 years old when he died. Silverstein and Fountain acted together on that October afternoon in '83. But while Silverstein spent the rest of his life in a concrete box, Fountain's story took a turn that nobody, least of all the Bureau of Prisons, saw coming. Tyler Davis Bingham. Every other man on this list did his killing face to face. Tyler Bingham did his with a message written in invisible ink made from his own urine, smuggled out of a solitary cell and carried by courier across the federal prison system. Within 24 hours of that message arriving at its destination, 2 men were dead and a third was fighting for his life. Bingham, known as the Hulk, was born sometime around 1946 or 47. His exact date of birth has never been publicly documented. He met Barry Mills inside USP Atlanta in the 1970s, and together the two of them built the Aryan Brotherhood's federal leadership into an organization that prosecutors later described as a criminal enterprise responsible for murder, narcotics, extortion, and gambling operations stretching across the entire federal system. At the time of the 2002 indictment, Bingham was already in federal custody on robbery and drug charges and would have been released in 2010 absent the new convictions. He was never going to see freedom again. The killing that defines Bingham's legacy happened on August 28, 1997, at USP Lewisburg in Pennsylvania. 2 weeks earlier, Mills had sent a coded message warning that a faction called the Toads had placed a hit on 2 AB members, declaring the war was on and ordering Lewisburg to be notified. Bingham composed the follow-up. He wrote the words "War with DC Blacks," signed it with his initials, and used his own urine as invisible ink to conceal the message. The technique was not unique to Bingham. AB members had been smuggling coded communications through the federal mail system for years, writing between the lines of ordinary-looking letters that would only reveal their true content when heated or treated with certain chemicals. Bingham's message was passed to AB shot caller Al Benton through a courier named Ronald Slocum on August 27th. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Within roughly 24 hours, AB members at Lewisburg acted on the order. Frank Joyner and Abdul Salam, both members of the DC Blacks, were stabbed to death. A third man, Byron Ball, was wounded but survived. AB defector Kevin Roach later testified that Bingham confirmed from solitary that he had given the order and that every AB member was expected to kill any DC Black they could reach. That was not the only murder tied to Bingham at trial. The federal RICO case also convicted him for the 1989 killing of Arva Lee Ray at USP Lompoc. Ray was himself an AB member, but he had broken multiple organizational rules. He had openly maintained a homosexual relationship, mishandled drugs, and disrespected other AB brothers. Under the Brotherhood's code, any one of those offenses warranted death. Ray was killed by heroin overdose. The method was deliberate. Bingham was also convicted for ordering the attempted murder of Latin Kings member Ismael Benitez Mendez at USP Leavenworth in January of 1992. According to the Ninth Circuit's published opinion, Bingham ordered a subordinate named Scott to kill Benitez Mendez, and Scott carried out the attempt by stabbing him in the back. He was acquitted of the 1993 murder of William McKinney at Lompoc. But acquittal on one count did not change the overall picture. The jury saw enough across the remaining charges to convict on the counts that mattered most. The trial in Santa Ana ran for 5 months in 2006. Bingham and Mills stood trial together before Judge David O. Carter, and the case became one of the largest prison gang RICO prosecutions in federal history. The evidence included coded messages, testimony from defectors who risked their lives to cooperate, and detailed accounts of how the AB's chain of command functioned even when its leaders were locked in solitary cells thousands of miles apart. When the penalty phase came, the jury split 8-4 in favor of life, not death. Judge Carter declared a mistrial on the sentencing question and imposed life without parole. Prosecutor Terry Flynn told reporters that both men had been effectively gutted and would be hidden away where they could do no more harm. Bingham's defense attorney, Michael White, said his client was deeply concerned about what life would look like going forward, noting that ADX Florence could be extremely restrictive and that the question now was just how restrictive they would make it. As of this recording, Bingham remains alive at ADX Florence under Bureau of Prisons Register number 03325-091. He was already serving time on robbery and drug charges when the RACO indictment came down in 2002. Without that indictment, he would have been released in 2010. Instead, he will die in a supermax cell, just like his partner Barry Mills did before him. The invisible ink dried decades ago, but the orders it carried are still working their way through the courts, the appeal processes, and the memories of the families who lost people because of two initials scratched in urine on a piece of paper. Bingham ordered his killings from isolation through coded messages and invisible ink. But back on that same October afternoon in 1983 at USP Marion, the man who acted alongside Thomas Silverstein took the violence to a level that earned him a title no federal inmate had ever held before. And unlike the men who issued orders from a distance, this one did all of his killing with his own hands. Clayton Anthony Fountain. The Bureau of Prisons has housed terrorists, serial killers, mob bosses, and cartel leaders. It has classified inmates as maximum security, high security, and special management. But in its entire history, it has never officially labeled any of them the most dangerous prisoner in the federal system. Except one. Clayton Fountain earned that designation after killing 5 men inside federal walls, including a United States Marine, 3 fellow inmates, and a corrections officer. He did all of it before the age of 28. And then he became a monk. Fountain was born on September 12, 1955, at the United States Army Hospital at Fort Benning, Georgia, the eldest of 6 children in a military family. He enlisted in the Marines, and in 1974, while serving aboard a ship in the Philippines, he murdered his immediate superior, Staff Sergeant Rin. He had stolen a pistol from the ship's armory and robbed a Filipino guard of a shotgun before committing the killing. He was sentenced to life and entered the federal prison system as a young man with nothing left to lose. His second killing came the following year. In May of 1975, at USP Leavenworth, Fountain and another inmate named Hugh Thomas Colum stabbed a prisoner named Robert Stewart to death. Both were convicted of first-degree murder under federal statute. The Seventh Circuit upheld the conviction on appeal. Fountain received an additional life sentence. He was 20 years old with 2 murders behind him, 2 life sentences stacked on top of each other, and he had barely begun. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. After his transfer to USP Marion's control unit, Fountain teamed up with Thomas Silverstein, and the two of them cut a path through the institution that remains unmatched in federal prison history. In 1981, they were convicted together for the strangulation of Robert Chappelle. In '82, they jointly stabbed D.C. Blacks leader Raymond Cadillac Smith 67 times in retaliation for Smith's repeated attempts to kill Silverstein. Each killing earned another life sentence. Neither man had anything left to lose, and the system had no way to escalate punishment beyond what they were already serving. Then came October 22, 1983. Hours after Silverstein killed Officer Merle Klutz on one part of Marion's H Unit, Fountain replicated the attack on another. He used the identical method, a handcuff key passed by a fellow inmate and a smuggled shank, to ambush correction officer Robert Hoffman. Hoffman was killed. 2 additional officers were wounded in the assault. Gang task force investigators later noted that Fountain had reportedly not wanted Silverstein to get ahead of him in the body count. The 2 killings happened on the same unit, on the same day, using the same technique. Marion went into immediate lockdown and never fully reopened as a general population institution. That was 5 killings inside federal custody: a Marine, 3 inmates, and a corrections officer. All committed by a man who had entered the system at 19 and would never leave it alive. The Bureau of Prisons constructed a custom-built underground steel and concrete isolation cell at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, specifically for Fountain. He was sealed inside and remained there for the next 2 decades. The cell was designed to ensure that he would never have physical contact with another human being without a wall of restraints between them. And then something happened that no one in the federal system could have predicted. On April 19, 1992, while shackled in his isolation cell, Clayton Fountain was baptized into the Catholic Church. He renounced the Aryan Brotherhood entirely and severed all ties to the gang that had defined his adult life, under the spiritual direction of a Trappist priest named W. Paul Jones. His cell was ritually blessed as a hermitage, and Fountain reportedly pursued a monastic vocation from behind bars. He spent his days in prayer and contemplative study, following a routine modeled on the daily rhythm of a cloistered monastery. He even sent a financial gift to the widow of one of his victims, a gesture that caught the Bureau of Prisons off guard. Father Jones later wrote a book about the experience titled A Different Kind of Cell. In it, he posed a question that the criminal justice system has never been able to answer. If Fountain's transformation was authentic, then is anyone beyond the mercy of God? It was not a rhetorical question. Jones meant it. Fountain died of a heart attack on July 12, 2004, at the age of 48. He had spent roughly 21 years in the custom-built cell at Springfield without ever leaving it. Whether his conversion was genuine or strategic has been debated ever since. Supporters consider it one of the most remarkable spiritual transformations in American penal history. Critics call it a calculated move by a man who had nothing else to play. That's not a typo, by the way. The man who was officially labeled the most dangerous federal prisoner in American history died as a baptized Catholic hermit in a concrete cell that had been consecrated as sacred space. Every man on this list so far came out of the same crucible, the Aryan Brotherhood and its roots inside San Quentin. But the next name built something entirely different from inside those walls. He co-founded a gang that would dwarf the AB in size, terrorize the streets of Los Angeles for decades, and eventually put him on death row at the very prison where it all started. Stanley Tookie Williams. On the night of February 27, 1979, a 26-year-old Army veteran and father of 2 named Albert Owens was working the late shift at a 7-Eleven in Whittier, California. A group of men came in, armed with a 12-gauge shotgun and a .22 caliber pistol. They had been smoking PCP-laced cigarettes. They forced Owens into the back room, destroyed a security monitor with a shotgun blast, and then shot him twice in the back. The register held exactly $120. That is what Albert Owens's life was exchanged for. 12 days later, on March 11th, the same man broke into the office of the Brookhaven Motel in South Central Los Angeles and killed the owners, 76-year-old Yen E. Yang and 63-year-old Tsai Shai Chen Yang, along with their 43-year-old daughter Yu Chin Yang Lin, with point-blank shotgun blasts. He took $50 from the cash register and walked out. Witnesses later said he bragged about the killings using a racial slur for the victims. 4 people dead in less than 2 weeks, for a combined total of $170. The man behind both attacks was Stanley Tookie Williams III, co-founder of the Crips. 4 dead, $170 in total. The gap between the scale of the violence and the value of what was taken remains one of the most disturbing details in the case. Williams was born on December 29, 1953, in New Orleans, and raised by his teenage mother in south-central Los Angeles after 1959. By his late teens, he was enormous, 300 pounds with 22-inch biceps, and he led the West Side Crips with a combination of physical intimidation and organizational ruthlessness. In 1971, he and Raymond Washington formally united their rival gangs at a Washington high school record hop into what became the Crips, the seed of what would grow into the largest African-American street gang in Los Angeles history. Williams himself later admitted the gang was a vehicle for terrorizing the streets, and he led a strange double life in the mid-70s, working as an anti-gang counselor at Compton College during the day, while running the Crips wars against the Bloods at night. Raymond Washington, his co-founder, was murdered in an unsolved drive-by on August 9, 1979, just months after Williams committed the killings that would put him on death row. Williams was convicted in 1981 and sentenced to death. The prosecution's case rested on eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence tying him to both crime scenes. Witnesses testified that Williams later bragged about killing Owens, saying that Owens was white and that he was killing all white people. He reportedly mocked the sounds the dying man made. After the Yang family murders, witnesses said he boasted using a racial slur and laughed about the victims. The jury deliberated and returned a death verdict. Williams was sent to San Quentin. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about why this case became one of the most divisive in California history. From death row, Williams did something that nobody expected. He began writing. He co-authored 9 children's anti-gang books with journalist Barbara Becknell, including the Tookie Speaks Out Against Gang Violence series. He founded the Internet Project for Street Peace and began corresponding with young people across the country, urging them to reject the gang life he had built. Starting in 2001, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 5 times and the Nobel Prize in Literature once, according to ABC News reporting from December of 2005. Swiss parliamentarian Mario Fair and several academics submitted those nominations. A 2004 FX biopic called Redemption starred Jamie Foxx in the lead role and drew millions of viewers. Public figures including Snoop Dogg, Sister Helen Prejean, Bianca Jagger, Mike Farrell, Danny Glover, and Sean Penn lobbied publicly for clemency. The case split California down the middle. On one side, people who believed Williams had genuinely transformed and deserved to live so he could continue his anti-gang work. On the other, the families of 4 dead people who had never received an apology. Williams maintained his innocence throughout all of it. He never apologized for the murders because he said he did not commit them. On December 12, 2005, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger denied clemency. In his written statement, Schwarzenegger posed the question directly. Was Williams's redemption complete and sincere, or was it just a hollow promise? He concluded that without an apology and atonement for these senseless and brutal killings, there could be no redemption. The denial landed like a hammer. Williams had exhausted every legal avenue, and every public appeal had failed. The execution began at 12:01 a.m. on December 13, 2005, at San Quentin's death chamber. Medical staff spent approximately 12 minutes locating a vein in Williams's muscular left arm, according to the Los Angeles Times. His death was pronounced at 12:35 a.m., 34 minutes after the lethal injection process started. As he died, his supporters gathered outside the prison walls and shouted that the state of California had just killed an innocent man. Albert Owens's ex-wife, Linda, had spoken to Williams by phone shortly before the execution. She told him to go with God. His stepmother, Laura Owens, watched from the witness gallery as the man who killed her stepson took his last breath. In a final taped interview with radio station WBAI, Williams said he stood strong and continued to tell the world that he was innocent, and that yes, he had been a wretched person, but he had redeemed himself. Williams was 51 years old. He had spent 24 years on death row at the same prison where the Aryan Brotherhood was born, where the Mexican Mafia consolidated power, and where some of the most violent gang members in American history served their sentences. He co-founded a gang that grew into the largest African-American street organization in Los Angeles, killed 4 people for a combined $170, wrote children's books from death row, earned Nobel nominations, and was executed in the same death chamber at San Quentin that had been used for decades before Governor Newsom dismantled it in 2019 under a statewide moratorium. Whether his redemption was real or performed is a question that outlived him. The 4 people he killed are still dead. The books he wrote are still in print. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Joseph Morgan. In 1961, 11 inmates escaped from the Los Angeles County Jail through a pipe shaft, using hacksaw blades that had been smuggled into the facility inside a prosthetic leg. The man who led the breakout was Joseph Morgan, and the leg was his. He had lost it years earlier when police shot him during a confrontation, and the amputation left him with both a disability and a hiding spot that correctional officers never thought to check. Prison staff gave him the nickname Peg Leg. What they did not realize was that the one-legged man hobbling through the exercise yard was quietly building the most feared criminal organization in the California prison system. Morgan was born Joseph Medjugarak on April 10, 1929, in the San Pedro area of East Los Angeles. His parents were Croatian Catholic immigrants, and his father anglicized the family name to Morgan after becoming a naturalized citizen. Growing up in Boyle Heights and the Maravilla housing projects, Morgan was raised in a predominantly Mexican neighborhood. He spoke fluent Spanish and later taught himself Nahuatl, immersing himself in Aztec history and Mexican culture to a degree that set him apart from virtually every other white inmate in the California system. His first killing happened when he was 16 years old. A 32-year-old woman he was involved with convinced him to murder her husband. Morgan beat the man to death with a rubber hammer and buried him in a shallow grave. He was caught, escaped pre-trial custody using another inmate's identification papers, was recaptured, and was sentenced to 9 years at San Quentin State Prison. He arrived as a teenager in a system that would hold him for the rest of his life. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. That sentence at San Quentin placed Morgan in the same institution where the Mexican Mafia would later consolidate its power after migrating from the dual vocational institution. The loss of his leg came later, during a police confrontation. Accounts of exactly how it happened differ. One version, attributed to former Mexican Mafia member René Boxer Enriquez, describes a bank robbery gone wrong. Another, from police writer William Dunn, says Morgan was shot while hiding from a murder warrant. Regardless of the circumstances, the amputation left him with a disability that would have sidelined almost anyone else in the prison system. Morgan turned it into an advantage. He hid contraband inside the prosthetic. He used the leg as both a weapon and a smuggling tool. And he became legendarily competitive on the prison handball courts, beating able-bodied inmates regularly enough to earn a reputation. Morgan's fluency in Spanish, his deep knowledge of Mexican culture, and his willingness to use extreme violence made him a natural fit for La M. In 1969, he was formally inducted as the first non-Hispanic member in the organization's history. They gave him the Aztec name CISO. After co-founder Rodolfo Cadena was killed in 1972 at DVI, Morgan emerged as the de facto godfather of the Mexican mafia. His cartel connections in Mexico bankrolled La M's heroin and cocaine pipeline into California's prisons and eventually onto the streets of Los Angeles. The pipeline worked in both directions. Drugs flowed in through visitors, corrupt staff, and mail, and the profits flowed back out to fund operations on the street. Morgan engineered a long-running alliance between La M and the Aryan Brotherhood against the Black Guerrilla family, creating an axis of power that reshaped the gang landscape behind bars for decades. Investigators have credited him with ordering what they describe as the first prison gang street execution in Los Angeles, carried out in 1971. That killing represented something new. It was the moment when prison gang politics spilled permanently onto civilian streets, and the boundary between the yard and the neighborhood disappeared for good. Retired Los Angeles County Sheriff's gang investigator Richard Valdemar later described Morgan's operation in blunt terms: "Buy our drugs and pay us a tax, or die." That was the offer. The Mexican mafia did not negotiate. They simply killed anyone who refused. Valdemar also noted that Morgan was legendarily competitive despite his disability, saying that he was the one-legged man people joked about in the ass-kicking contest, and that he was actually a champion on the prison handball courts. And somehow, it gets worse. In 1992, director Edward James Olmos released the film American Me, a fictionalized account of the Mexican mafia's origins. One of the characters, J.D., played by William Forsythe, was widely understood to be based on Morgan. The film depicted La M in ways that the organization considered disrespectful, and the response was swift and brutal. Morgan sued Olmos and Universal Pictures, claiming the character used his likeness without consent. Investigators later alleged that two former Mexican mafia members who had served as consultants on the film were killed in retaliation for what the organization considered violations of its code. The message was clear. Anyone who talked to outsiders about La M's internal business, even in a fictionalized context, was putting their life at risk. Morgan died on November 9, 1993, of inoperable liver cancer at the prison hospital at California State Prison, Corcoran. He had been diagnosed just weeks earlier. A compassionate release petition had been filed, but never granted. His attorney, Shirley MacDonald, said she had visited him about 6 months before his death and noticed he had been losing weight and did not look well, but that Morgan was an intensely private person and never complained about anything. He was 64 years old. He had spent the vast majority of his adult life in prison, rising from a teenage killer at San Quentin to the godfather of one of the most violent criminal enterprises in American history. And he did it all on one leg. Morgan ran the Mexican mafia through charisma, violence, and cartel connections. But the man who comes next on this list operated with something different entirely. The deputy district attorney who prosecuted him compared his mentality not to a gang leader, but to a serial killer. Timothy Joseph McGee, A deputy district attorney in Los Angeles named Hoon Chun spent years prosecuting gang cases. He had seen every kind of violent offender the city could produce. After the trial of Timothy McGee, Chun told reporters that in all his years of work, there was one quality he had seen in McGee that he had never encountered before. It was a quality more typical of a serial killer. McGee enjoyed killing. McGee was born on April 27, 1973, and grew up in the Atwater Village neighborhood of Los Angeles. His mother, Olivia, raised him after his father left to work an oil pipeline in Alaska. The absence shaped him, but not in a way that invites sympathy. By his teens, McGee had risen to become a high-ranking shot caller for Toonerville Rafa 13, a street gang that the Los Angeles Times reported he ran with a military-like structure. He organized physical training sessions and led members to gun ranges for target practice. He demanded discipline and enforced it with violence. His street names were Huero and Eskimo, references to his pale complexion. He was barely out of his teens when the killings started. Prosecutors alleged that between 1997 and 2001, McGee was responsible for at least 12 homicides and 10 attempted murders. The scope of the violence was concentrated in the neighborhoods around the Los Angeles River, where Toonerville's territory overlapped with rival gangs. In 2007, he was convicted of 3 murders and 4 attempted murders. The first was Ronnie Martin, 25 years old, killed in October of 1997. Martin was shot 28 times by McGee and other Toonerville members. The second was Ryan Gonzalez, who was either 16 or 17 years old at the time of his death on June 3, 2000. McGee allegedly killed Gonzalez because the rival gang member shared his street name, Huero. Police later said the neighborhood was not big enough for 2 people with the same street name. A teenager died over a nickname. That's not a typo, by the way. The third murder conviction was for Margie Mendoza, 25, on November 9, 2001. McGee and another Toonerville member named Eduardo Rodriguez ambushed a car driven by Duane Natividad. Mendoza was Natividad's girlfriend and the mother of his 3 young children. She was hit multiple times and died at Glendale Memorial Hospital. McGee was also convicted of the attempted murders of LAPD officers Thomas Baker and Carlos Langareca on July 4, 2000. Both officers survived the ambush and were later awarded the LAPD Medal of Valor. Other charged victims included John Marshall High School student Marty Gregory Roybal, 17, who was shot while spray painting near Redcar River Park in September of 2000, and a friend named Christina Duran, who was executed after she informed on McGee. In 2002, a 60-officer federal task force took up the case. The investigation had grown beyond what the LAPD could handle alone. McGee was placed on the United States Marshal's 15 Most Wanted list on September 25th of that year. For months, he evaded capture while the task force tracked leads across multiple states. He was finally captured in Bullhead City, Arizona, in 2003, after a manhunt that had stretched on for over a year. His own writing helped convict him. A notebook of rap lyrics recovered by investigators was read aloud at trial. In his own words, he described himself as a killer with a gun, out to have some fun, saying that in his dreams he heard screams and that the pleasure he felt was obscene. The jury heard every line. The notebook was not ambiguous. It was not metaphorical. It was a confession dressed in rhyme scheme, and the prosecution treated it as exactly that. The trial judge, Robert J. Perry, described McGee's behavior at sentencing as treating killing like some kind of perverse sport, as if he were hunting human game. Perry called him a committed killer and an obvious danger to society. Retired LAPD Detective Andy Teague offered a simpler assessment. He called McGee a monster. McGee was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin's death row. In 2012, while housed at San Quentin, he was charged with slashing 2 correctional officers with a shank as he was being returned from a shower. The attack was reported by the Los Angeles Times and NBC Los Angeles, but the disposition of those specific charges has never been publicly confirmed. He was later transferred to Kern Valley State Prison, where he remains today. Then, in April of 2025, something happened that the families of his victims had never imagined. The California Supreme Court unanimously reversed McGee's murder convictions and death sentence. Justice Goodwin Liu wrote the opinion, ruling that the trial court had made a reversible error by removing juror number 5 during guilt phase deliberations. The court held that the removal violated McGee's constitutional rights and that the error required a full reversal of the judgment. The ruling did not address the evidence of guilt. It did not declare McGee innocent. It found a procedural defect serious enough to invalidate the entire verdict. The reversal did not set McGee free. He remains imprisoned indefinitely under a separate 3-strikes life sentence that was not part of the appeal. Los Angeles County District Attorney Nathan Hochman stated that his office was reviewing the ruling in detail. Whether prosecutors choose to retry the murder charges remains an open question. The families of Ronnie Martin, Ryan Gonzalez, and Margie Mendoza are still waiting for a resolution that may take years to arrive, if it arrives at all. McGee killed on the streets of Los Angeles and was convicted in a courtroom. But the next man on this list proved that you do not need to be on the outside to order an execution. He proved that from inside a prison cell, with nothing but a hit list and a willing accomplice, you can reach out and kill the very people who put you there. Clarence Ray Allen. On September 5, 1980, a man named Billy Ray Hamilton walked into a small grocery store called Fran's Market in Fresno, California, carrying a sawed-off shotgun. He shot and killed 3 people. Brian Schledowitz was 27. Josephine Rocha was 17. Douglas Scott White was 18. 2 customers, Joe Rios and Jack Abbott, were wounded but survived. 5 days later, Hamilton was arrested in Modesto for an unrelated robbery. In his possession, police found an address book belonging to a man named Clarence Ray Allen, along with a handwritten list of names. Every name on that list was a witness who had testified against Allen at a murder trial 2 years earlier. Hamilton had been sent to kill them all. Allen was born on January 16, 1930, in Blair, Oklahoma. He later claimed partial Choctaw and Cherokee heritage, though state records listed him as white. In the 1970s, he ran a security guard business in Fresno that doubled as a front for armed robberies. The business gave him access to buildings, alarm systems, and security schedules, and he used that knowledge to plan burglaries with a small crew of associates. In 1974, he planned a burglary of Fran's Market using his son Roger's teenage girlfriend, Mary Sue Kitts, to steal the owner's keys. Kitts was young and impressionable, and Allen used her as the inside connection. The plan worked initially, but Kitts could not live with what she had done. She developed a guilty conscience and confided the truth to market owner's son, Brian Schledowitz. Allen found out. He ordered her killed. Kitts was murdered, and Allen was convicted of first-degree murder, burglary, and conspiracy in 1977 and sentenced to life at Folsom State Prison on March 16, 1978. And that should have been the end of it. Allen was locked up. Kitts was dead. The witnesses had done their civic duty and gone home. They had cooperated with law enforcement, testified under oath, and returned to their ordinary lives expecting the system to keep them safe. Allen had a different plan. From inside Folsom, he conspired with fellow inmate Billy Ray Hamilton to eliminate every witness from the Kitts trial. The conspiracy was methodical. Allen provided Hamilton with names, addresses, and a list of targets. When Hamilton was paroled, he went directly to Franz Market with a shotgun. 3 people who had done nothing wrong except tell the truth under oath were dead before anyone understood what was happening. A 17-year-old girl and an 18-year-old young man were among the dead, killed because an inmate in a Folsom cell decided that no witness should survive him. The Franz Market massacre was prosecuted by the California Attorney General after the Fresno District Attorney recused his office from the case. The venue was moved to Glenn County. Over a 23-day trial with 58 witnesses, Allen was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and conspiracy to murder 8 witnesses. When asked during the trial how he felt about informants, Allen said he did not like them, and in some cases, a great deal of harm should come to them. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin. Hamilton was also sentenced to death. He died of cancer in 2007 without being executed. Allen spent over 2 decades on death row, during which time his health deteriorated badly. He went legally blind. He went deaf. He developed diabetes. He required a wheelchair. On September 2, 2005, just months before his scheduled execution, he suffered a near-fatal heart attack and had to be resuscitated. The irony was not lost on his critics. Allen had survived long enough for the state to kill him, and the state had resuscitated him so it could go through with the execution on schedule. Officers at San Quentin said he could still walk unassisted and read his mail despite the official diagnoses. But the physical decline was undeniable. Defense attorneys argued that executing a man in his condition constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The courts disagreed. None of it mattered to the Ninth Circuit. In 2005, Judge Kim McLean Wardlaw wrote the opinion denying Allen's petition for relief. She stated that the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming and that Allen continued to pose a threat to society, specifically to the very people who had testified against him. She wrote that he had proven himself beyond rehabilitation and had shown he was more than capable of arranging murders from behind bars. Allen was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin on January 17, 2006, at 12:38 in the morning. It was the day after his 76th birthday. He was the oldest person ever executed in California, and at the time, the second oldest execution in the United States since 1976. The only older person put to death was John B. Nixon of Mississippi, who was 77 when he was executed in 2005. Allen's last meal included buffalo steak, KFC white meat, fried bread, sugar-free pecan pie, sugar-free black walnut ice cream, and whole milk. He wore a yellow, green, and red beaded headband and placed a feather on his chest, gestures tied to the Native American heritage he had claimed since 1988. His final words, read by Warden Stephen Ornosky because Allen could barely speak, were that it was a good day to die, that he loved everyone, and goodbye. Medical staff required a second injection of potassium chloride to stop his heart. The execution took 33 minutes from the first injection at 12:05 to the pronouncement of death at 12:38. The Schledowitz family released a statement afterward. It had taken 30 years from the burglary of Franz Market to that night for Clarence Allen to receive his just punishment. 30 years of legal proceedings, appeals, and waiting. 3 innocent people dead because they had the misfortune of being in a store when a hitman walked through the door. Allen remains the last person executed in California. The death penalty has been under moratorium since Governor Newsom's 2019 order. But San Quentin's death row did not empty out when executions stopped. Among those still sitting on it is a man who killed a sheriff's deputy during a drug raid and then spent the next 4 decades running the Mexican mafia from behind bars. Jesse Gonzalez. On May 29, 1979, sheriff's deputies and narcotics officers from the Baldwin Park and El Monte police departments arrived at a house in the city of La Puente, east of Los Angeles, to serve a search warrant for drugs. The officers were plainclothes, driving unmarked cars. They knocked on the door and announced themselves. When Deputy Robert Esquivel kicked in the door, he saw Jesse Gonzalez braced against an interior wall, pointing a shotgun directly at the entry. Gonzalez fired. Deputy Jack Williams was hit in the chest and killed. Esquivel returned fire and wounded Gonzalez. Inside the house at the time of the shooting were Gonzalez's 2-month-old son and a 6-year-old girl. As Gonzalez was loaded onto a stretcher and wheeled toward an ambulance, he raised his fist and shouted a gang slogan for his Puente Street gang, followed by a profanity directed at the officers surrounding him. Prosecutors later cited that moment as evidence of intent. Gonzalez was convicted of first-degree murder of a peace officer in the lawful performance of his duties, a special circumstance that made him eligible for the death penalty. He was sentenced to death in 1981 and sent to San Quentin. If Gonzalez had stopped there, this would be a very different story. He did not stop. From death row, Gonzalez became something far more dangerous than the drug dealer who had shot a deputy in a doorway. Court testimony presented in 2020 and 2022 in a separate case, People v. Victor Soto, established through judicial findings that Gonzalez was a documented Mexican mafia member operating under the moniker Bird out of La Puente. He functioned as a shot caller from death row, directing hits and managing prison drug trafficking operations from inside San Quentin's East Block. The mechanics of how a condemned inmate runs a criminal enterprise from death row are not complicated. Phone calls, visitors, kites passed between cells, and associates on the outside willing to carry orders. What made Gonzalez effective was not the method, but the longevity. He operated for decades without being shut down. A jailhouse phone call intercepted in February of 2023 between 2 La Puente gang members at the Los Angeles Men's Central Jail discussed splitting drug smuggling profits with Bird. The call was recorded, transcribed, and entered into evidence. Former Los Angeles County District Attorney Steve Cooley described Gonzalez in direct terms. He was not only a cop killer, but a documented Mexican mafia shot caller. The judicial record now supported what investigators had suspected for years. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. For decades, Gonzalez operated from death row with a level of impunity that investigators found difficult to explain. The legal fight over his death sentence is still ongoing, and it raises questions about the original prosecution that have never been fully resolved. The prosecution's original case relied heavily on testimony from a jailhouse informant named William Acker. Years later, it was revealed that Acker had a history that prosecutors did not disclose to the defense, forming the basis of a Brady violation habeas petition. Under Brady v. Maryland, the prosecution is constitutionally required to turn over evidence favorable to the defense. The failure to disclose Acker's background potentially tainted the trial's fairness. Former DA George Gaskin's office at one point appeared willing to concede the claim, but on December 5, 2023, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge George Lamelli rejected the habeas petition outright. The ruling surprised many observers who had expected the court to at least grant a hearing on the Brady issue. Gascon's office clarified in court that it had never sought Gonzalez's release, only a correction of the sentence. Gonzalez's federal habeas case remains active, and his attorneys continue to litigate in federal court. Retired Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department homicide detective Ray Verdugo has maintained his position on the case for years. He has said he has no doubt that Gonzalez planned to kill a cop, and that Gonzalez knew the raid was coming before officers ever knocked on that door. As of this recording, Jesse Gonzalez is approximately 75 years old and reportedly uses a wheelchair. He remains on California's death row, though executions have been suspended statewide since 2019. His conviction stands. His habeas fight continues in federal court. Every man on this list so far killed for power, for money, for gang loyalty, or for survival. The last name on this list killed for none of those reasons. He killed because of the color of his victim's skin. Gunnar J. Lindbergh. On the night of January 28, 1996, a 24-year-old man named Thien Minh Lai went rollerblading at the Tustin High School tennis courts in Orange County, California. It was the evening of the Dallas Cowboys' Super Bowl 30 victory, and the streets were mostly empty. Lai had no reason to think he was in danger. He had fled Vietnam with his family on a boat in 1983, served as president of UCLA's Vietnamese Student Union, and earned 2 master's degrees, including one from Georgetown University. He dreamed of becoming the first Vietnamese American ambassador from the United States to Vietnam. He was 24 years old, and he had already accomplished more than many people manage in a full lifetime. Gunnar Lindbergh was 20 years old that night. He and a 17-year-old named Dominic Michael Christopher had been drinking and decided they wanted to find, in Lindbergh's words, a Japanese person to assault. They went to the tennis courts. They found Lai alone. Lindbergh stabbed Lai at least 23 times, including 14 blows directed at the heart. He slashed both sides of Lai's throat. Christopher kicked him repeatedly in the face. Lai died on the tennis court. And no, I'm not making that up. What caught Lindbergh was not forensic evidence or a witness. It was a letter. After the killing, Lindbergh wrote to his cousin Walter Ray Dulaney IV in New Mexico, casually boasting that he had killed a Japanese person at Tustin High School, that he had stabbed the victim to death, and that the man had been gasping for air as he died. Lindbergh wrote that he had nudged the victim's face with his shoe, then told Christopher to kick him, and that Christopher still had blood on his shoes. He included a smiley face in the letter. He closed by saying he was having a great time in Tustin and wished his cousin were there. Dulaney's wife turned the letter over to police. She read it and decided she could not stay silent. Detectives matched a specific detail in the letter, a reference to a single car key found beside the body, to a fact that had never been released to the media. Only the killer and the investigators knew about that key. That was how they knew the confession was authentic. Without the letter, and without the wife's decision to bring it to law enforcement, the case might never have been solved. Lindbergh had left no witnesses alive. The tennis courts were empty that night. It was his own need to boast about what he had done that brought investigators to his door. Lindbergh was not new to violence. In 1992, at the age of 17, he had shot an 11-year-old boy 3 times with a pellet gun. One pellet lodged in the child's heart after severing an artery. The boy survived, but the injury was life-threatening. Lindbergh served the bulk of a 5-year sentence for that crime. While imprisoned in Missouri in 1993, he allegedly bragged about running a racist prison gang. After his release, he moved to Tustin, California, where his ideology only hardened. Police searches of his home turned up Klan literature, white Aryan resistance materials, Aryan Research Fellowship documents, swastikas, and white supremacist posters covering the walls. Co-workers at a Tustin Kmart testified that he routinely used racial slurs against Black and Asian customers in front of other employees. The trial lasted through September of 1997 in Orange County. The prosecution's case rested on the letter, the forensic evidence, and the extensive documentation of Lindbergh's white supremacist beliefs. Lindbergh was convicted of first-degree murder with two special circumstances. The first was murder during an attempted robbery. The second was a hate crime special circumstance under California Penal Code. Section 190.2, subsection A16, murder motivated by the victim's race, color, religion, nationality, or country of origin. It was one of the earliest applications of California's then-new hate murder provision, and the case set a significant legal precedent for how racial motivation could be established through a defendant's own words and possessions. Lindbergh was sentenced to death. In 2008, the California Supreme Court unanimously upheld the conviction and death sentence. Justice Carlos Moreno wrote the opinion, noting that the materials seized from Lindbergh's home, combined with evidence that he had participated in the white supremacy movement, bragged about running a racist prison gang, referred to the victim using a racial slur, and admitted to others that he disliked people of Asian descent using derogatory terms, collectively established the racist motivation for the crime. Chief Justice Ronald George and Justices Corrigan, Baxter, Chin, and Werdegar all joined the opinion. Christopher, who was a juvenile at the time, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. Thien Minh Lai's sister, Thu Lee, went on to become a United States Navy officer who served in Iraq and Kuwait. She later said that her brother had wanted her to be a strong and intelligent woman with the courage to find her own adventure, and that she often wondered what he would think of how she turned out. She said the thought brought both smiles and tears. As of this recording, Gunnar Lindbergh remains on California's death row at San Quentin. He has been there since his 1997 condemnation. California's death penalty moratorium, in effect since March of 2019, means that no execution date is forthcoming. He is 51 years old. Thien Minh Lai was buried in 1996. He was 24. The letter that convicted his killer included a smiley face. That was the 10th and final name. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.